The western rural end of Howard County is rich in history. Several of Maryland's prominent families and 3 of her governors hailed from the region. The areas we will visit on this show are simply an illustration of the vast amount of history you can find in the West. Join us now for a look through that past.
The western portion of Howard County stands in contrast with the east. The latter has always been more densely populated, with mills and ports providing the main focus for its residents. But the west has an identity all its own. For decades, farming has been the main occupation here. As you drive down the rural, windy roads, the towns you do come upon are small hamlets, placed carefully at the crossroads of avenues that lead westward.
So again, you have a crossroads community where people are coming from the country through a certain area looking for services. And some towns grow large from there, and sometimes they disappear. Now in 1860, the 1860 Martinet map does not show many communities, but by 1878 in the Hopkins Atlas, and that's only 20 years later, but there are significantly more communities by 1878, and I think that means the population maybe was denser, that people were congregating more into communities for whatever reason.
With the building of the Frederick Pike in 1806, Route 144 was formed, connecting Baltimore to Frederick and points west. In 1820, that road was expanded even further west and became known as the National Pike. The coming of the railroad in the 1830s brought the development of towns along its tracks. Although the most common occupation in the region was farming, many residents of these villages made their living tending to the needs of travelers along the turnpike and tracks, operating inns and taverns. Some of these hamlets have diminished and faded away over the years, but a few are still in existence today. Poplar Springs is one of the county's westernmost towns and one of its oldest, in existence since 1795. The village was named for a row of poplar trees now gone, and this spring which flows through it. The trees surrounded this church, now called Poplar Springs United Methodist. They have obviously been removed, and the church itself has undergone a number of physical changes as well as name changes. When the deed was written in 1870, this is what the church looked like. In the 18th century, the town was advertised and used as a health spa. The waters in its spring were believed to have healing powers.
The doctors in Baltimore ordered people to what was a kind of a hotel, you might say, down here on the Woodbine Road of Fort 94. And the doctors recommended that they come up here and get water for people, ailing people, to use out of that spring.
As the railroad reached out to this area, Poplar Springs soon became a summer resort for those people looking to escape the simmering city heat of Baltimore. Unfortunately, as the railroad moved even further west, travelers followed, and soon Poplar Springs was no longer used as such a retreat. Although today there is not much left to the downtown area, at the turn of the century there was a store, a school, hotels, and 3 churches. All that remains now are homes, churches, a small store, and the spring. Aubrey Fleming was born and raised in the town, as were several generations of his family, most raised in this house, which is still standing. After working at a number of different jobs, Mr. Fleming ran his own farm for 27 years.
The farm was very depleted because the man that owned the farm had died, and his nephews was just renting the fields out. So I went there, and with interest, I knew it was a good farm, and I went to work on it. First year I had, that fall that I went there, I moved there, and I lived there 6 months. I moved over there in November, and we put in a wheat crop there of 20-some acres. I got 10 bushels of wheat to the acre, all I got off of it.
Daisy is a small community not far from Poplar Springs. Becky Thomas was born and raised in Daisy, in the same house she lives in today.
Well, I lived in this area. I was born in this house, and it was 7 children, my mother and father. My father was a farmer, and he used to travel around to different farms, and one of his main jobs in the summertime at thrashing time was ricking straw. And he used to walk from here to West Friendship and rick straw all day. Then he'd come back and had his own chores to do at home.
Although the neighbors weren't quite as close as they are today, the children were still able to socialize with each other.
We used to have, our music was a graphophone. We used to have to turn the handle with the records, and we would go to different houses who had nice little records, and we'd do our dance. And then we used to hold hands and sift sand, go round and round and round, dig all the grass up out of the yard.
Miss Thomas attended a one-room schoolhouse through the 7th grade. Then she moved to Baltimore, working during the day as a domestic for the Hess family and attending Frederick Douglass High School in the evenings. When her mother passed away in 1953, Miss Thomas returned to her home and has remained there ever since. As you travel east on the former National Road, the next town you come upon is Lisbon, probably the largest in the West. Located at the crossroads of the National Turnpike and Route 94, it too became a summer resort. But again, as the pike moved further west, so did Lisbon's clientele. Nevertheless, in the mid-1820s, the dozen families that made up the community earned their living servicing travelers along the road. An example is this building that served as a stagecoach inn in the late 1800s. It was around 1802 when Caleb Pancoast bought his land from the first 2 settlers of the area. He was optimistic about building a town on the brand new National Road. His philosophy, where it went, businesses would follow. Pancoast surveyed his area in 1811 and divided it into 100 quarter-acre lots. They were situated along a main street and 2 alleys. The alleys were added in anticipation of the village expanding, an expectation that was never met. Pancoast's home was the first built in the town. Through the years, it was added onto and served at various times as a meeting house, private residence, and a combination general store and post office. When the railroad began to bring visitors west, the owner of the property built an addition to serve as a hotel for travelers. The front addition still stands, but Pancoast's original house was disassembled in 1983 because of deterioration. In the early years of Lisbon, Pancoast constructed a union chapel to be used by people of all denominations. The first congregation to sever ties with the chapel were the Presbyterians. Located several yards behind the old hotel, Harmony Presbyterian Church served the congregation for many years. Although church records were burned in a 1911 fire, the church is believed to have been in existence since early 1836. The small frame structure now serves as a private residence. Behind the home, one can find a graveyard bearing the names of some of Lisbon's first families. Today, the Lisbon Elementary School is the only school located within the town. But in years gone by, the community was the site of quite a few schools. In the 1840s, Lisbon Schoolhouse No. 17 was built north of Route 40 and Woodbine Road. It was 1889 before a 2-room wooden schoolhouse was built in this area, what is now a community park. The first 2-year high school was established in Lisbon in 1899, but was closed the next year due to lack of appreciation by the citizens. Another try was made at a high school in 1920, and that stayed around until 1958, when the older students began traveling to Glenelg High School. Lisbon was then left with just an elementary school. When integration of the school system began in 1965, Helena Gaither became one of the first black teachers at the Lisbon School. Born and raised in the area, Ms. Gaither herself attended Daisy and Cooksville elementary schools. After graduation from Harriet Tubman High School, she received her teaching degree from Bowie State College and returned to the county to teach.
I taught at Guilford Elementary first, and I was there for 3 years. Then I went to Cooksville, and that's where I was educated. And I went back to teach for 7 years. Then when schools integrated, I went to Lisbon, and I was there for 25 years.
During those 25 years, her students brought her lots of enjoyment and a few surprises.
In social studies, we always talked about the family unit. So a parent had asked me if she could bring the youngest member of the family in to share with the class. Well, this was fine. But what happened was, when she came the next morning, she came directly from the hospital with a newborn and brought him into the classroom.
Just down the road from Lisbon, and actually considered part of the same community as Poplar Springs in Lisbon, is Cooksville. In 1802, Thomas Cook purchased and settled on a strip of land near what is now the intersection of 144 and 97. The town that was later developed in that area was named after Mr. Cook. When the building of the National Road reached this village, a gentleman by the name of Joshua Roberts bought some of Cook's land and built an inn, naming it after himself. The Joshua Roberts Inn is well known for a visit it received from Revolutionary War hero General Lafayette in 1824. The inn building has changed hands a number of times since then, and in the 1960s was renovated. In the 1860s, Cooksville consisted of a tavern inn, post office, blacksmith shop, and schoolhouse number 14. For a short time in the 1840s, a girls' school called the Warfield Academy stood on land near Cooksville. In 1867, the building was granted to George Snowden and other trustees of the Cooksville area by Thomas Hood and his wife. Its sole purpose was to be used as a school to educate the black children of the Cooksville area. In 1935, the Cooksville Colored School was expanded to 8 grades and made it up to 4 years of high school in 1937. In 1950, Harriet Tubman High School replaced the now inconvenient Cooksville School. In 1898, not long after the property was granted to the community, a clause was added to the deed that stipulated the building was to be used for school and church purposes.
When the Hoods deeded the church to the trustees, they designated this church to be used strictly for a school. I mean, this building to be used strictly for a school and no other purpose. Well, because of the size of the community, they needed a place for their school, so they met in this building. And eventually they had to go back and ask the heirs, was it okay for them to give them permission to use it for not only a school but a church, and that's what happened.
They began meeting in the lower level of the school building. In 1898, the present structure was built. The church and its congregation were an important part of the black community then, just as they are now.
The church played the most important role in the community because since they were not allowed to learn how to do public speaking in any place else except their churches, their schools, this is where a child learned how. This is where if you couldn't read and write and you had to do business that took reading and writing, well, you had somebody in the church who could read and write. They were called scribes. And they would help you transact your business.
Mount Gregory is just one of several black churches still active in the county today. Tucked away in an often overlooked corner of the county are the remains of Roxbury Mill, the only sign that there was once a town in this crevice along Cattail Creek. The original mill is believed to have been located here between 1760 and 1800. In 1818, James B. Matthews and his new bride, Kitty, built a store near the creek. A post office, blacksmith shop, and home soon formed the community of Roxbury, with a newer mill built on the grounds where the original mill had stood. In later years, although Matthews decided to move his family a few miles west, the mill continued operating and changed hands several times over the next century. Irene and Raymond Smallwood purchased it in 1922.
And then what he did grind, he ground for cattle, for pigs, for chickens, and nearly every farmer in the area they all had their own chickens. And but any sort of grain he would grind or to what they wanted. And in the beginning, this was a flour mill also, and he did produce flour for a while, but he could not compete with the western flour mills, so he discarded the flour mill and put in a mixer, a special grinder and a mixer for the different kinds of feeds that the farmers wanted.
Mm-hmm. So all that is left of the small hamlet on the banks of Cattail Creek is this structure and a few homes, one of which is Mrs. Smallwood's. When James and Kitty Matthews relocated a few miles west, looking for more room in which to raise their family, they ended up founding another small town. While building what would become the family home, Bloomsburg, the Matthews lived in this structure, known for years as simply the little house by the side of the road. In a lot next to the little house, the Matthews built and operated a combination store and post office, and the town soon became known as Matthews, a name it would keep only for a short time.
They had a number of children, all who had good educations. They were Quakers, and they too believed in education as the Ellicotts did. And one of their sons, Lycurgus, which is an unusual name, and they called him Kirk. He's referred to as Uncle Kirk, later on Professor Matthews. He evidently opened a private school there and called it the Glenwood Institute. And he remarked about the beauty of the area and called the area Glenwood.
In the late 1800s, the building was destroyed by fire. The store and post office were moved into another building across the road. From 1919 until 1978, the business was operated in the same building by the Pindell family.
My family bought it in 1919, July 1919. And it was run as a store and post office until 1978, when my wife became sick and she retired. And I rented out for, a few times. And then we moved it in 1981, we moved it over to Mr. Boyer's property.
Elizabeth Pindell served as its postmistress from 1937 to 1978. When the post office was moved to its own facility in 1976, the old Matthews storehouse and antique shop. Later it was moved across the road and today serves as part of the Glenwood Garden Center. The Pindell family not only operated the Matthews store, but lived in one of the Matthews' former homes. Dependence was built by Alfred Matthews and was acquired by the Pindell family in 1919. On the northern end of town stands the Union Chapel, built in 1833 on land donated by Charles Warfield. In 1842, it was officially designated a Methodist church of the Howard County Circuit. It thrived for over a century, but by the 1950s, the congregation had dropped and the chapel had fallen into disrepair. It was forced to close its doors. In the 1960s, a group of citizens banded together to refurbish the building. Before the doors were once again open in 1982, the trustees had a lot of work on their hands.
The floor was virtually gone. Windows were not missing, but were in bad, they were racking and that sort of thing. The ceiling was about 80% down. The balcony on the northeast corner here was lying down because instead of having church mice, we had church termites. And they must have been big and fat because they certainly ate their way through the building.
Today, the building is used by the St. Andrew's Mission from St. John's Episcopal Church in Ellicott City. Standing behind the Union Chapel is the Oak Grove Cemetery, where many of Glenwood's first families are buried, including the founder of the town, James Matthews, and his wife, Kitty. Heading north on Route 97, one comes upon an intriguing little log cabin. Although it doesn't match the grandeur of some of the other historic manors and estates of the western end of the county, it's just as important to its history. The cabin was built on property owned by Thomas Hood in the mid-1800s. When he freed his slave, Sarah Jane Powell Dorsey, he presented this home to her.
Well, it was built for my great-grandmother in 1850 when she was set free from slavery and sold all her sisters and brothers to the south, New Orleans. And they built her this log cabin to make her content to stay here.
To date, 7 generations of her descendants have lived in this house. Clarksville is probably the second largest town of the Western District. With its hub located around the intersection of routes 108 and 32, Clarksville is named for the Clark family, who settled in the area in the late 1700s. James, John, and David Clark emigrated to this country from Belfast, Ireland. In the early 1800s, one of their descendants, also called James Clark, bought property in the area and built a hotel and a store. By 1840, the town had expanded, and Clarksville was granted its own post office. In the late 1800s, the village was known as the Paris of the 5th District, with politicians and visitors stopping in Clarksville to rest a while and discuss the latest politics. Public activity of the time centered around Election Day and church picnics, perhaps the most popular and well-known of which is the Picnic of St. Louis the King Catholic Church. First held in 1878, these gatherings are still held today, though they have changed dates and times through the years.
And now we're serving 3,500, around 3,500. And that makes a big change in what you prepare. I've been in charge of the Kugelers. I'm the Kugler lady for a good many years. I really don't know how many years. I imagine it's from around 1960. And I used to prepare 3 bushels, the family and I. We do it as a group. And now we're preparing 13 bushels. So that gives you an idea of the change that has taken place through these years.
St. Louis Church itself is a notable landmark in the Clarksville area. After the original chapel was built in 1855, the Catholic population grew out of its first building. A new chapel and rectory were built in 1889, a mile away from the original structure and in downtown Clarksville. Almost a century later, the parish relocated to an even newer building, but the original buildings are still used. For many years, the town of Clarksville was the center of activity for families who farmed in the area. and the economy of Clarksville depended upon what the crops of nearby farms yielded. For a time, a one-room schoolhouse operated in Clarksville on the site where the Clarksville Fire Department now stands. In 1912, parents of the area were concerned about their children traveling all the way to Ellicott City to continue schooling beyond the 7th grade. Turned down by the school board, the neighborhood built the Clarksville High School in 1914. That building was eventually demolished, and another school was built on the other side of Route 108. The present structure serves as the gateway school for students with at-risk problems. The Thompson family has lived in the Clarksville area for several generations. Paul Thompson was born and raised on the land where he now lives, and he's seen a number of improvements in the area since he was young.
I used to go to St. Louis Church in a horse and buggy. I remember when they put down the concrete road that's there now, they had it all torn up, and it was, whenever it rained, it just got so muddy. We couldn't hardly get through with a horse and buggy. The horses just had to struggle to pull the buggy through the mud to get to church.
West Friendship was one of the first villages travelers would meet while riding along the National Pike in the early days. Located 19 miles from Ellicott City, its first post office was opened in 1864. Until 1914, the turnpike out to West Friendship was made of cobblestone, and there was a toll to be paid along it. Travelers were charged for vehicles, humans, and animals, and the fees depended upon the type of vehicle and the destination of the traveler. Today, the name West Friendship is closely associated with the Howard County Fair. Grange competitions preceded the fair and were held on the front lawn of Brendel Manor Park until the mid-40s. It was then that a fair association was formed, and the competitions were held in various other locations in the county, before settling into the current fairgrounds in 1952. The week-long event has been held here ever since. Although it was a farming community, West Friendship had a few businesses in the early days. There was a general store where the post office was located, as well as doctors and blacksmiths. In 1956, Doris and Alan Van Sant built the first shopping center for the community. It now includes many of the necessary conveniences and is located at the intersection of Routes 32 and 144. One of the county's most noted families is the Carrolls. Charles Carroll of Carrollton was the third generation to make Howard County his home. In 1711, his grandfather settled in what would become the center of Howard County. The elder Carroll began building the family home, known since then as Doe Reagan. The structure was added onto throughout the generations and is now one complete building, 300 feet long. It includes a chapel in which the most prominent member of the family is buried under the altar. Charles Carroll of Carrollton served on the Continental Congress and was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Of his three homes in Annapolis, Frederick County, and Howard County, Charles the Signer enjoyed Doe Reagan Manor the most. In later years, John Lee Carroll, a descendant of Charles and Governor of Maryland, made the manor his home. This country home is still occupied and tended to by a direct descendant of Charles Carroll. Adjacent to the grounds of Doe Reagan lies the Franciscan Friary and Novitiate. Although the order bought the property and established its novitiate in 1928, one of the structures that is used by the friars today was once a home called Folly Quarter. Built in 1832 by Charles Carroll for his granddaughter Emily Kate McTavish, it included many of the luxuries of the day. When the Franciscans acquired the property, they not only put the mansion to use, but also built a residence that is a mini replica of the original friary in Assisi, Italy. As devout Catholics, the Carroll family provided a great deal of support to the church. In 1830, Charles Carroll laid the first stone for St. Charles College. The institute was a seminary for young men wishing to study for the priesthood. Located just across the Frederick Turnpike from Doe Reagan Manor, the college was destroyed by fire in 1911. It was then rebuilt in a more convenient location in Catonsville in Baltimore County. The Glenelg Country School is one of Howard County's private educational institutions. Serving students from kindergarten through the 12th grade, the school has been in existence since 1954. The building in which the lower grades are housed was at one time a renowned estate. Sarah Dorsey Howard was given the land on which it stands as a dowry in 1735. The original L section of the home was built by Sarah's son, Ephraim. It was later added onto by General Joseph Tyson in 1854 and was given the name Glenelg after a castle in Scotland. In 1915, the estate was purchased by Mr. and Mrs. William Bladen Lowndes. They developed the manor's extensive gardens and added a 6-hole golf course, swimming pool, and tennis courts. The property is still put to good use today.
The total environment is a part of what we're here for, and so we get the kids out a lot. Parents use the facilities. We have family day on this lawn, and we try to use it as much as we can. We encourage the parents and the students to get out and enjoy this beautiful 85 acres.
Marriottsville is one of Howard County's northernmost hamlets. Believed to have been founded in the late 1700s, the town became known in the middle of the next century as a railroad town.
It's like Woodstock, Hood's Mill, many of these places along the river that grew up or developed because of the train coming through. And again, they were crossroads with the train. If you look in the 1878 map, you will see there was a schoolhouse at Marriottsville at that time, railroad station, and a post office.
Although its name came from the Marriotts, one of Maryland's prominent families, it is uncertain whether any members of that family ever lived in the town. One of Howard County's most prestigious landmarks is located within the boundaries of Marriottsville. Waverly dates back to the mid-1700s when it was built by Nathan Dorsey and his new bride, Sophia. The property soon found its way into the hands of Colonel John Eager Howard. A governor of Maryland, Colonel Howard presented Waverly as a wedding gift to his son George and daughter-in-law Prudence. George also occupied the governor's mansion several years later, the only son of a governor to become a governor himself. Through the years, Waverly passed through the hands of many owners. In an extremely run-down condition, it was eventually acquired and restored by the Society for the Preservation of Maryland Antiquities. In 1990, the estate was purchased by the Howard County government. Today, it's available for weddings, receptions, and social gatherings. We've spent most of our time looking back at the West through the eyes of history, but in reality, it hasn't stood idle over the years. As in many regions of the country, development has helped the population of the West grow. Though there is still a great deal of farmland, small modern communities are springing up. In an effort to preserve farming as an industry and the farming community, voters in Howard County decided 13 years ago to implement agricultural preservation.
What we do is we buy the development rights off of farmland so that residential development, commercial development, or industrial development does not take place on the property, and that all that is left on the property for the property owner is agricultural uses.
Traveling along avenues used for over 2 centuries of people heading west has a way of connecting you with the past. It's easy to see the attraction this part of the county has and still holds for those who savor its unique character.
Hi, I'm Charlie Figge. I represent the western region of the county. I was born and raised in the county. I think there's a lot of history out here for you to see. We invite you to come out, take a leisurely ride through the county, see for yourself the countryside, and enjoy its history.